My name is James Fallows. I'm a writer for the Atlantic magazine. I'm delighted to be here with this superb panel to talk about the situation of China now, what we can make of it, how we should respond to the things that are happening, what we know, what we don't. I'll confess that as a journalist, my secret joy in having this panel assembled is I've been wanting to ask my real China gurus what's happening there, what do we, how should we prepare, and these are exactly the people I'd be going to, so I'm very glad. Starting from my left, your right, we have Orville Schell, whom you all know from the Asia Society, from countless books and magazine articles. Orville and I were comrades when you were dean of the Berkeley Journalism School, and I was one of your staff there, and Orville has been in China. When were you first in China?
75.
And working in a factory, is that right?
And a farm.
On a farm, and so Orville is one of the paramount go-to people for understanding China's developments internally, its relations with the outside world. Next to him is also my good friend Minxin Pei, now Claremont McKenna College. You've been in China since age 0, right?
Yes, I was born there.
You were born in Shanghai and has been in the US for the past several decades, but a very eminent scholar, often with a cautionary tone about how to think about China's evolution. When my wife Deb and I were moving to China a little more than 10 years ago, one of the books we had for the flight over was China's Trapped Transition, about how the seemingly unstoppable juggernaut of China's economic growth was leading to contradictions, whose consequences will be felt just about now, as you were saying. And Minxin has other books he'll be telling us about soon. And at the end of the panel is Adam Segal of the Council on Foreign Relations, who has an expertise both in China and in digital affairs, digital security, hacking in general. And so as Chinese affairs and digital affairs increasingly overlap, Adam is very well positioned to talk about them. The premise for our conversation today is going to be that over the past couple of years, the era of which Xi Jinping has been in power, there's been a notable change in many ways inside China itself and into the rest of the world as it touches China. I was telling Minxin yesterday that I found myself using a phrase I would never have anticipated before. That phrase is the golden age of Hu Jintao. It's like if you would speak of the golden age of Rutherford B. Hayes or the golden age of Millard Fillmore. Nobody thought that Hu Jintao was an eminent leader in his time, but in retrospect, we still had some evidence of continued liberalization then, of more cooperative rather than less cooperative dealings with the outside world. We see the signs of control in many forms inside China. We see economic tensions. We see military expansions and all the rest. And so we're going to try to have this discussion mainly in two parts. First is understanding what is actually happening in China. And that is always a problematic effort, especially within China, but from the outside too. So we'll spend the first part of our conversation saying, what do we know about what has changed there in the past 3 years under Xi Jinping? The other half of our conversation will be, what should we do about it? We essentially means anybody other than Xi Jinping and the people around him. That is, the populace of China, the populace of the United States, the Western world, the rest of Asia, et cetera. So what do we know and what do we do about it based on what we know? So that's the plan. I'm going to start with an initial round of questions, opening questions for each of our three panelists, starting with Minxin Pei. Minxin, how, as you think of the economic shift in China over the past couple of years, where you see all the business section stories about slowdown and topping out and whatever, you see the reports about repression and controls in China. Is this just one more up and down within the wave of change we've seen over the last 40 years, or is this an actual change? Has the trend in China actually changed?
I think it's the latter, it's the actual change, because this round of repression is fundamentally different from the previous episodes of repression. It has lasted longer, it has reached new depths in terms of severity and in terms of creativeness. For example, in the past, you seldom see on your net, actually did not see victims being paraded on television, confessing their crimes, really reminiscent of Stalin's show trials. And that's a qualitative change. And the other qualitative change is that previously certain groups or individuals would be untouchable. For example, lawyers would be left alone. But this time, repression has reached civil rights lawyers, human rights lawyers, advocates for workers' rights. So and also in the cyberspace, you see a lot more repression, a lot more effort at controlling the flow of information. So if you add up the new things, then it is a qualitative change.
And just to follow up for one moment before going to Orville, certainly the last time people thought something was really different in China was in 1989, after Tiananmen. Is this a more significant change than happened in 89 and thereafter?
Well, 89, that was, the repression following 89 did not last very long.
Right.
And it was associated with a particular event. And this time it was associated with a fundamental shift in government policy, because the new leadership thought and actually has declared that the previous decades, there was not enough control of society. So I did not say this, we talked about this yesterday. What has made the past 3 years quite unique is the return of fear to Chinese society. And I've written a piece on this, because you don't feel the same kind of fear about being arrested, just uncertainty. You don't feel that, but now you feel.
Thank you. So Orville, you've written a number of pieces, probably most prominently a long piece in the New York Review of Books a couple of months ago, again, arguing sort of in a way similar to Minchin's, that there actually is a change underway and it's different from what we've experienced since the time you were first there as a farmer in the 1970s. In what way, what evidence do you take most seriously for saying that there actually is a change politically, economically, diplomatically, et cetera?
You know, it's interesting, Jim, that you raise the rather astounding notion of the golden era of Hu Jintao, who was thought to be a rather undistinguished and not a particularly powerful, dynamic, or charismatic leader. But if you look at Chinese history since Deng Xiaoping, you find a very strange evolutionary pattern that I think those of us who followed it can't fail to note. Deng Xiaoping was followed by Jiang Zemin. Now, here was a guy, you may remember, big owl-like glasses and dyed hair. And at the time, people viewed him as almost clownish. He loved to sing Home on the Range and cite the Gettysburg Address in English. And there was some kind of slightly buffoonish quality about him. However, you look back at this man now. This is the platinum age. This man was incredibly open, and I remember very vividly, I was on the trip that President Bill Clinton made. This is not so long after 1989 and the Beijing massacre. And here were two men who were actually seemed to take pleasure in each other's company. Yeah. And they went into the Great Hall of the People, and I remember them coming up the stairs of this great socialist, monument. And Jiang Zemin, to the astonishment of everybody, announced that the press conference that they would hold jointly would be broadcast live on radio and television. And then they proceeded to have a conversation about Tibet, about all kinds of things. And Jiang Zemin was not reading off of notes. Now, I mention this only to say that the next leader, Hu Jintao, was perhaps a little less, he was gold, not platinum. But you begin to see a kind of an arc away from openness and an arc towards more centralized leadership, more sort of authoritarian controls in the media, academia, the way businesses are regulated, just the way society is allowed to evolve. And I think this is quite startling. And what this has done, sadly, in my view, is that we used to have this kind of somewhat fuzzy notion that China and the US were more or less going in the same direction. We were, in other words, converging. A little more cultural exchange, academic exchange, some more business. The presidents would meet and things would get better and better and they would get more and more open and I suppose in a crude sense more like us. But that now, sadly, I don't think you can presume.
Let me follow up on one point about that before going to Adam, and it's not to point everybody to my wonderful book about Asia called, in fact, More Like Us, but that's a separate thing. Actually, the subtitle of that book, which was about Japan and the United States in 1991, the subtitle was Making America Great Again. I am looking for my royalties on the damn hats.
You better be careful, Jim.
Yes. On the assumptions of convergence, I think it's important to clarify, I don't think any sophisticated Americans ever assumed that China would democratize. But my belief in the assumption was that China would become sort of easier to deal with as time went on. Would you agree with that description?
Yeah, I think we had this kind of notion that, that we were both in some historical current, that they weren't going to turn into a Jeffersonian democracy, but they were on the right evolutionary glide path towards something less indigestible.
So Adam, in your particular work in cyber and military and sort of the security aspects of this relationship, would you make the case that there's been a change in these past 3 years as well?
Well, I think in some aspect, the digital world is the one where the heartbreak is the biggest, because given Orville's point about what we thought was going to happen with China, the internet, Chinese netizens were going to be this force for civil society, for this great openness. We all knew there was going to be censorship, but we thought the Chinese would not be able to keep ahead of it. Right? President Clinton had that famous metaphor that the Chinese wouldn't be able to control the internet. It'd be like nailing Jell-O to the wall. But it turns out that the Chinese are very good at nailing Jell-O to the wall. And so what we've seen over the last 3 years in the digital world is the same type of repression. We had Weibo, which is a Twitter, Facebook kind of agglomeration, which was being used to spread ideas and spread information, was Crackdown. Some very large users, which were called Big Vs, were kind of paraded around and told you were going to be responsible if a rumor was retweeted 5,000 times. Well, if you have 10 million or 20 million followers, that's not a big number of retweets. So we saw that crackdown. We saw a massive consolidation of power. President Xi Jinping became head of a small group on cyber and digital issues, which didn't exist before, which meant that there was kind of issues about how do you get the government to work more closely to kind of control cyberspace. And then we saw a much more assertive and aggressive China internationally. Right? Before, the United States had really been defining the debate. Right? The internet was going to be free and open. Secretary Clinton gave a series of speeches in 2011 and 2012 that said, online rights are the same as our rights in everyday living. And the Chinese, for a while, just basically kind of cowered and said, well, the United States is trying to contain us, they're trying to beat us up in cyberspace. But over the last 2 years, they've been much more assertive internationally. They have promoted an idea of cyber or internet sovereignty, which says, no, internet is like every other space. And we're going to assert our ability to rule it. They had a leader from the propaganda ministry called Lu Wei, who just left his office, who then traveled around the world and spread this message and began to lean on US companies. Right? So if you wanted to do business in China, there was more interest in where your technology was, where the data was stored, what access the Chinese might have to it.
And to follow up here, before the next round, back in the golden age of Hu Jintao, I did a story for The Atlantic about the odd role of VPNs in those days. The way you could get around the Great Firewall was to spend a relatively trivial amount of money to get a virtual private network. And two things were true then I wanted to ask you about. One is, the Chinese government didn't really care about the people doing this. It was foreigners, it was intellectuals, and as long as most Chinese people stayed within the confines, they didn't care. Now there seems to be much more attention to VPNs. Why is that so? Second, I heard often from Chinese internet users, even the last year or two, that we on the outside were more concerned about this repression than they were, because still they could do as much chatting as they wanted, et cetera. Why did the government crack down on VPNs, and are the Chinese average people actually concerned now about these controls?
Yeah, I mean, I think the last point first, it's, you know, it is a universal truth of the internet is that people use the internet to look at funny cats. And the vast majority of Chinese users are not using it to read Amnesty International or the State Department's human rights reports, and they read in Chinese. They don't, you know, they don't care about access to the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or those other things. So for the average Chinese user, you know, they're still using it the way that they wanted to do. I think the attacks on the VPNs, which they've, you know, throttled the speed, sometimes knocked them offline, I think goes to Minxin's point earlier, is that the repression is now wider. Certain communities before seemed to be off limits. As you said, tech entrepreneurs, scientists, academics, these were all people that the Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin saw as part of the new vanguard, right? They were in the three represents, right? They were under, which was a new theory about, you know, the pushing forward the party. They were going to play this role. But I think part of the reason why they've attacked it is to send a message to these people that you are not immune from this larger concern about control and ideas.
This is actually an audience poll question. In one of the interviews I was doing in China, a government official was very offended that I didn't know what the three represents were. How many people here know what the three represents are? All of our panelists, of course, know the three represents. So it is an interesting aspect of China's public diplomacy. This is a really important part of the program, but it's, even now, I can't remember what they are.
Neither can I, actually. I'm surprised that it came up.
It's like the new type of great power, major power relations. So the next wave of questions, here's what I want to get at. You all have said in different ways there is a change in terms of internal controls, in terms of digital controls, and all the rest. What I'd like to get at next is where this is going, what we can foresee in the next couple of years of Xi Jinping's time, of you know, presumably he's going to have another 5-year run, and do we think this is are we heading towards contradictions, or where are we going? So Minxin, I'm going to start again with you. A very powerful theme of your book on the trap transition was the contradictions of the Chinese model. It was good for getting out of poverty. It was not good for becoming really rich. Do you see contradictions building up now, and what is going to happen in the next couple of years?
Well, I think the contradictions are building up at two levels. One, at the one level, it is building up within the regime itself. From the outside, Xi Jinping is often viewed or labeled as a reformer. He's actually a revolutionary. He has dismantled a political order that was set up after the Tiananmen massacre. He's torn up the rule book, and as a result, the regime itself is deeply divided. I have not seen a time at which the bureaucracy itself, the lower level of the regime, is so embittered about the top leadership. And that kind of situation is actually very dangerous for the regime. So at that level, I foresee some real turbulence ahead. At the other level, that is between the regime and society, that takes longer because from my own contact with ordinary Chinese people, most of them remain optimistic, confident. So it will probably take about 5 to 7 years until the economy really grinds to a halt. Right now, it's only slowing down. And there are big problems ahead in terms of debt levels and so forth. So once the majority of very large number of ordinary people feel that the best days are over, then there will be an inflection point. So in terms of contradictions, that the elites sense the contradictions a lot sooner than the ordinary people. So right now the problems are much more serious within the regime, and I do not see the possibility of an imminent popular uprising, but that probably can occur in 7 to 10 years from now.
And to be clear about what you're suggesting or implying, when you say there are really bitter tensions within the regime and instability, in practice, what does that mean, for example, at next year's Congress?
Oh yeah, next year will be very critical because I don't want to bore you with the Chinese version of criminology. That is, next year there will be a party Congress at which they have to designate Xi Jinping's own successor. That will be a big fight because the the China watching community is now divided on what's going to happen. If a successor is designated, that would mean you actually can see Xi Jinping's future has an expiration date. And that's something he does not want to see, clearly. So next year will be a big fight.
So Orville, let me ask you about these contradictions too. I've been impressed over the decades, among the many things I've been impressed in your work and insight is you have had a sort of default assumption that on the one hand, this can't go on the other hand, it keeps going on. And so how do you think about yourself and how would you urge all of us to think about the tensions between Chinese practices that really can't continue, but they probably will continue?
Well, what makes this such a bedeviling proposition is that we actually don't have a model for whatever it is that China is doing, and most Chinese don't really know what the end goal is. So they're, in Deng Xiaoping's famous parlance, they're feeling their way over the stones across the river. And still, they don't know what kind of a system they're aspiring to. And that means that it's very sort of unclear in concept and destination. But I would have to say, you know, if you look at this system, as all of us have now for decades, by any logic that we grew up, any analytical tools, it shouldn't work. And in any event, we don't have an example of anything like it working, so we're rather skeptical. But it has worked. At least it's gotten China to where it is, and China has accomplished an incredible amount. I mean, anybody who goes there sees this, and it's rather breathtaking to see. So you have to approach this with a certain skepticism about your own skepticism, because somehow this thing is coherent. Now, I agree with Minxin that within this system there are an enormous amount of contradictions that have been tightening. And I think, you know, we used to think that when Deng Xiaoping came to power, sort of waved his wand, you know, the revolution was over. And everybody thought, okay, great. It's sort of like a stage of a rocket. It drops off and the rocket goes on. I think what we begin to see now with Xi Jinping is the actual durability of the effect of this very profound revolution that Mao launched for decades and decades, and that it got into the blood system of the system in ways which we didn't properly account for. And it's now re-expressing itself so that when contradictions tighten, we can all see them. Someone like Xi Jinping, who his formative years were during the Cultural Revolution, he put his toolbox together then. And when push comes to shove, he tends to reach into that toolbox and take the things out that he feels comfortable and familiar with. And what are they? They're controls, centralization, propaganda, and I should say also this very pernicious notion of hostile foreign forces, which are part of China's whole narrative for, again, decades, that it's us against them, the imperialists, the colonialists, the predators in Japan, all of these people have always been conspiring to lay us low.
And I'm going to come back to that in a next round, but I ask you one other follow-up too. You've had now connections at many levels of Chinese society going over the decades. Do you find the Chinese, you know, are they acting in any different way now than they did, say, after Tiananmen, of really wanting to get out, wanting to get the kids out, in a way that would make you think it's a dicier situation than before?
Curious. I mean, the way it always works in China is that opposite things are happening at the same time. On the one hand, you're having these demonstrations of patriotism and a willingness to be obedient to the party's diktats, et cetera. On the other hand, we do find, you know, rather massive. I mean, the money is coming out of China, whether it's capital flight into real estate, we can see that, where the mergers and acquisitions count as a panicked reaction. The simple point is that anyone who can is throwing an anchor to windward. They're coming over to this country, they're having their wives have babies here, so at least they have a kid with an American passport. There are all sorts of kind of very devious ways to get money out so that if push comes to shove, they too can just slip away.
I'm going to have an audience poll question before I ask Adam about this. Orville mentioned the industry, as it is in a lot of U.S. cities, of having Chinese mothers go and deliver babies there. My own hometown in Southern California has a giant presence of this. As an American, I actually think this is a good thing. I think it's good and sort of building the tendrils of connection between China and the US. How many Americans, when they hear of this, you can vote whether you're American or anything, how many think this is basically a good or at least a benign thing to have lots of Chinese babies being born as US citizens? How many are worried about this in one way or the other? Interesting. So I say like 2-1 benign. So
Or maybe benign for us, Jim, but malign for them.
yes, I'm speaking from my own, make America great again point of view. So Adam, I'd like to ask you about the contradictions in the tech world of two sorts. One is a theme that I have pushed, so I hope you agree with it, is that China's ambitions both in the university world and the tech world are going to be permanently lobotomized, if you will, the more they tighten these internet and communication controls, because world-leading scientists won't want to go to a place where they can't use the internet or whatever. So I'd like you to talk about whether you think that contradiction is intensifying, and also how US companies, notably Google and Facebook and LinkedIn, how they are navigating this chasm.
Yeah, so the big question in science technology studies has always been, can you create innovation with top-down controls? And the Chinese are desperate for innovation, right? That has to be the next stage of growth, because to be the factory of the world is labor-intensive, it's energy-intensive, and historically, the Chinese don't want to be dependent on the West for technology. It goes back to the 1870s, if not before. They want to be able to compete on high technologies. So what we've seen is a massive expansion of science and technology spending. The Chinese now spend about 140 billion on R&D a year, more than the EU combined, more than Japan, only second to the United States. Chinese scientists went from about 20th in paper production to number 1, although they still lag on actual citations. 6 million university graduates a year, 80% of them in science, technology, engineering, and math. So they want to move up the value chain. Innovation, Li Keqiang, the premier, just announced that this is a new push. So the question is, can you do this and control very, very tightly on the internet? I don't think they can. That was the thesis of my last book, which is that if you're trying to create a culture where you want to move ideas from the lab to the marketplace, it's more than just hardware. You need more than just scientists. You need more than just the most advanced machinery. You need a culture that you're willing to question your PhD supervisor. Or you don't need bureaucrats that are determining what is going to be the most innovative idea. You need the actual scientists. The most interesting statistic that I think that came from this is that soon after Google left, right after Google was hacked and they refused to censor Google searches in China any longer, they left, which meant that it became harder for Chinese scientists to use Google Docs and Google Scholars. And there was a survey that basically 80% of the scientists said that their work had been affected. And science now is global, right? You can't create innovation without being global. So I think this is going to hurt them on the long term. What's going to happen for US companies is probably best summarized or best symbolized by a photo that Mark Zuckerberg posted on his last trip to China of him running through Tiananmen in the middle of the morning. So anyone who's been to China knows that you do not want to run outside, right, because it will kill you. Right? I was in Wujian for a conference. There was only one day where the air particulate matter dropped below 100. The rest of the time it was over 250, which is dangerous to be out at any moment of time. So Mark Zuckerberg does this picture of him running through Tiananmen to create this image that he's happy to be in China and that he's learning Chinese, he's studying Chinese. When Lu Wei, the cyber czar, came to visit him, he showed him that he had a copy of Xi Jinping's book, right? Because Facebook is blocked in China, and Facebook wants to get into China because that is the 1.3 billion people, and they don't have that market. So how do you do that and maintain Mark Zuckerberg's stated desire for free speech and free flow of information? The Chinese have made it very clear that if they ever let Facebook in, they will do it under their own terms. Those terms will probably look like what you said for LinkedIn. So LinkedIn is in China, and they have basically two separate services. If you're in LinkedIn China, you see things that only the Chinese have said you can see. If you're in LinkedIn the States, then you see the normal things. So Facebook would have to make a decision to fork the technology, which is going to be a decision for lots of US companies. Are they going to fork for the China market, or are they going to try to maintain this global platform?
And a brief follow-up, my personal biased opinion, as I think of the Google approach and the Facebook approach, is that neither of them is going to succeed in the Chinese market, but at least Google is keeping its dignity.
Yeah, I think that's right. Like, you know, Google in many ways was sui generis, right? They had not as much at stake in some ways as other technology companies did. So they could basically tell the Chinese government to get bent, right? They were going to go off and do their own way. And when they were censoring in China, they did say, look, we are censoring. Here is a little thing that says we have censored the thing. Facebook, I do think it is, they look like the traditional kind of view of, I've come to see the emperor, I'm going to kowtow, and you are going to let us in under your terms. I am very interested to figure out how Facebook is going to, if they do eventually get in, how they're going to turn around to their users around the rest of the world and say, this is a compromise we had to make.
Yeah. So we're moving now in the what do we do about this stage of the discussion. We could spend hours and hours and hours talking about what's going on, but I'd like to sort of spend some time thinking that if we agree that the political mood is changing, the contradictions are intensifying, the pressure on technology companies, internal and external, are going up as well. How do we think about a changed approach to this? And so Orville, I'm going to start with you this time. My opening contention would be, from the time of Richard Nixon through the time of Barack Obama's first term, there was a more or less consistent U.S. view, bipartisan consensus, that it was better to engage China than not, that China would become gradually easier to deal with. It was better for us if they prospered, despite all our remaining disagreements. Does any part of that 40-plus year consensus need to be changed now, and if so, how?
Well, I think I think we do have to, if we're going to be a world leader. And interestingly now, when you're in Asia, and we were talking about this, I mean, I'm just astounded as an American to find out how Asian countries are looking to us for leadership, protection, guidance, everything. And with Europe falling apart, I mean, this puts an enormous burden on us to lead. So how do we do that in the present equation? So we have engagement, which I think at all times we should keep the door as wide open as we can for every kind of collaboration that's possible. And one example of this would be climate change, which is quite hopeful. Nuclear proliferation could become more hopeful. There are others. On the other hand, I think the part of the equation that is really increasingly out of kilter is the hedge part. Mm-hmm. And this becomes important because we've got some real challenges in the South China Sea. This incredible, look at a map, folks, at this udder-like protrusion that comes down from the South China coast, you know, skirting by Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia.
Are you all familiar with the 9-dash line? Let's forget the 3 represents.
More important than the 3 represents.
The 9-dash line. So Orville, explain the 9-dash line.
Okay, the 9-dash line is a historical line that the Chinese Communist Party says gives China, a little bit unclear what it is it says that gives them, but basically it's ours. And it's the whole of the South China Sea. And then it skirts up along Vietnam, down around the Philippines. And all of these islands are now in contention, and China's building landing strips, missile bases, they're sucking up coral reefs and making islands. In other words, they're saying, we're wealthy, we're powerful, we're back, and we want a Monroe Doctrine. Now, there's only a couple problems with that the Caribbean doesn't have a Japan with a considerable military force, or a South Korea, a few other things. So this puts enormous pressure on us to figure out a response. You can't just say, oh, well, fine, you know. So what are we going to do? And this is a very difficult problem. So what we've done to date are what we call FONOPs, Freedom of Navigation Operations, where the 7th Fleet steams by territory that the Chinese claim. And it's an incredibly complicated subject I won't get into. But this is where the United States, it seems to me, is going to be required to arch its back in a very delicate high-wire act at the same time as it does in cyber. And you remember what happened when Xi Jinping was coming to Washington, and there was this massive hacking going on. And basically, Obama said to Xi, you're going to have a really rotten trip here unless we work something out. And mirabile dictu, a couple days later, they had an agreement.
Yep.
So my view is, yes, you need to embrace China, but you also need to stand up to China, because China pushes you, you get off balance, they'll push you again, they'll push you again, they'll push you again. The question is how.
And can you give us one specific example of a way the U.S. or Western powers could stand up that wouldn't backfire?
Well, here I thought you were going to defer to my esteemed colleagues, Jim.
I'm going to ask Minxin that too, but Minxin can. We can. But that point is, it's a hard thing.
Yes, I have some ideas, but let's hear.
So Minxin, how does the question of, with your expertise of what's going on inside China with the leadership, what externally can be done that will be most effective in steering this evolution in less troublesome ways?
Okay, I think in the short term, the next 12 months, it will be very hard, because the political calculation in Beijing is to be tough on foreign policy issues. President Xi Jinping just cannot afford to appear to be weak. So, but looking beyond the next 12 months, I think that there are several big things the US can do. One is to really internally inside the US get a consensus on how to deal with China, a new consensus. And secondly, the US will have to get as many allies on board as possible. And then communicate very clearly, not openly, but through back channels, new ground rules. That these are things, if you do, we're going to push back very hard. And then follow through. Otherwise, you just don't have credibility.
And to ask you where I was asking Orville too, what's an example of how the U.S. or others could push back without making things worse?
Well, I actually would really put a lot of chips on the South China Sea, because this is where core American interests lie. You can lay out a scenario as if you do X, Y, Z, we're going to do X, Y, Z. Because the South China Sea is an area where the U.S. strength is overwhelming. Mm-hmm. If you think about military strength, diplomatic assets, and legal justifications, everything is really on the U.S. side. If you can mobilize these resources, the U.S. is more likely to have a more favorable outcome without suffering real consequences. It's very different from the economic side, because if the US and China gets into a real economic tussle, then the costs are quite high for the US. But the South China Sea is a very different matter.
So Adam, so how do you think about what the US, what non-Chinese countries should do?
See, I'm not sure framing it as, if we want to limit ourselves to things that will not make it worse. Mm-hmm. Because I think that for a long time, the Chinese have counted on us not wanting it to make things worse, right? Because that in many ways, we have signaled to them that the relationship might mean more to us than it does to them, even though they're more dependent on us than we are on them. And so in the cyber world, for a long time, the argument was, well, if we do anything in response, then the Chinese will take it out on US companies, or they'll penalize us in some way. But the Chinese are already doing all those things. And so as Orville said, we finally drew a line in the sand, and it wasn't just President Obama saying, President Xi, this is going to be a problem. We basically leaked that high-level sanctions were coming, and probably were going to hit some people very high up in the Chinese administration, that we're going to penalize them. They signed this agreement. We're not sure if they're going to follow through. There has been some reduction, according to the most recent reports from some cybersecurity companies, that the hacking has gone down. Are they just getting better and not getting caught? That might be the outcome, but right now we're seeing it. So I agree that we need to draw lines, quite honestly. Part of the problem is do we have the attention for it right now? Right? Because we've been complaining since the pivot in the first part of the Obama administration that the Middle East is really a distraction, and our long-term concern is the rise of China, and the future is Asia. Well, we've been saying that for a long time now, but we keep getting distracted by things that happen in the Middle East, and our allies are not convinced. Right? They know that we send our ships by Chinese fake artificial islands, or we do an overflight, but they're just not convinced that we're there for the long term. So I do think that it may actually be some things that do cause some blowback.
So,
Jim, just
yeah,
one
go
point.
ahead.
I mean,
Yeah.
I think one really practical thing. We don't want to forget that we have treaty obligations with Korea, Japan, and the Philippines. We have Vietnam, very interested in making nice and being a closer ally. Even Malaysia and even Indonesia now, where Chinese are starting to have terrible trouble with fishing fleets in the Indonesian Navy. I think to some real reinforcement of the United States sort of alliance structure in Asia.
Yeah.
We have an amazing situation where 5 years ago, every country in Southeast Asia was quite friendly to China. They've done a wonderful job in cultivating allies. Today, they haven't got a single ally.
Right.
Burma's gone. Vietnam has turned. Korea is sort of in a pivot. Philippines is very alienated.
Cambodia is still sort of friendly.
Cambodia and Laos, and even Thailand's in a kind of a strange androgynous state. But basically, the neighborhood has turned for them.
So I'm going to open up to questions for you all in just a minute. I have one brief final round here, just to have a quick answer from each of you. I think last year in this space, Graham Allison of Harvard was talking about the Thucydides trap, that China and the U.S. would talk each other into inevitable war by preparing for the other as an enemy. They would sort of heighten these intensities. Now, start with you, Adam. Just briefly, is that how worried are you about China and the U.S. talking themselves into conflict, World War I style?
I don't think it's inevitable, but I do think there has been a dramatic change in the language. I think, as Orville said, the language on the U.S. side always used to be hedge and engagement. But the language now is coercion and deterrence from the U.S. foreign policy. How do you get the Chinese to stop doing something or get them to do something that we want them to do? That, I think, is dramatically different than before.
Minxin, what do you think about this?
I don't think it will be a hot war. It's more likely to be a repeat of the Cold War.
Orville.
I do worry that we could have some incidents. On the other hand, I also fully believe that insofar as China remains a utilitarian country, they recognize the enormous importance of the United States in maintaining relations. So when it does come right up to the edge, I think they will probably back off. But one can't be entirely sure.
Thank you. So it's time for questions now. If you raise your hand, we'll start here in the front. A microphone will come to you. And after that, since I can't see past the lights very well, I'll ask microphone bearers. So if you will bring this microphone to this gentleman here, and then I'll just call alternately on microphone holders. Okay. And if you identify yourself, please.
Thank you. Mark Davis. How does the TPP controversy fit into all of this? Putting aside all the controversy on the U.S. side, how do our potential trade partners in Asia look upon the possibility of the U.S. failing to move forward with TPP?
Who would like to start with that? Orville?
Well, I think with alarm. And I mean, there are two ways to look at TPP. One, in terms of our internal economy and manufacturing, which is largely where the election is casting its glance. The other is in kind of a geostrategic sense of the U.S.'s ability to lead and to actually have a sort of catalytic policy in Asia. So I think most Asian countries would be very, very disappointed if we can't come through on this.
I think you can also put it in the framework is that there was a foreign policy disaster that revolved something called the Asian Investment Bank, in which the Chinese set up to help fund infrastructure in Southeast Asia and other places, which the Obama administration made the unwise decision to basically oppose and to try to block our friends from participating, which they all bailed. Basically, the Brits very quickly said, no, we're going to participate. And instead of the US saying, oh, it's an interesting idea, maybe we can help define what the investment norm should be and transparency and accountability. So we have one example of a failed institution building, and if we have the TPP on top of that, of the US not engaging in the region, I think that also looks bad for US leadership.
I think there's a microphone here. Yes.
Hello?
Yes.
My name is Bruce McEver. I'm interested in the state of religious oppression in, or whatever it is. I was traveling in China several years ago, and I was very impressed with the way that they had restored the Buddhist monuments in the center of towns, the Tao monuments, and et cetera. They put Christians are sort of pushed over in the corner where they were. But what is the state of that at the present time?
In terms of religious repression, Buddhism has not been the target. It's Christianity, and it appears to be restricted to one particular province, that's Zhejiang province, where President Xi used to be the party secretary. The new party chief of that province appeared to really resent symbols of Christianity. So that person has a systematic campaign of tearing down crosses and destroying churches. But outside the Zhejiang province, I have not seen similar campaigns against Christianity. Incidentally, Christianity in China now is very big. It's about 100 million people.
We should also point out that there seemed to be a crackdown against Islam.
Yes, especially in Xinjiang.
That's
in Xinjiang province, where the Uyghurs are located, is a Turkish minority group, and there has been protests for greater autonomy and a outside independence movement. There are now restrictions on who can study in mosques, what type of, can you fast? So state employees cannot fast during Ramadan. So there's been tighter controls on that side.
Who has the next microphone? Yes, here.
Hi, my name is Will Obendorf, and I have two separate questions. One is, do you really think it's a censorship issue, why they're not allowing Facebook and other internet companies, or is it more of an economic issue in terms of, you look at, they have Renren in China for Facebook, they have Baidu instead of Google, and on and on. Yeah, and then part two is, I think there's also this contradiction in the monetary policy where they're trying to stabilize the currency. Much of that's been doing by, selling off foreign reserves. On the other hand, they're lowering bank capital ratios to increase lending, and those are kind of contradictory forces. So how do they do that? And if they're just going to keep on burning through foreign reserves, I think they went through 100 billion last year. They have 3 trillion. Like, where's the breaking point?
Why don't you start with the tech companies and then as much of the rest as you want?
Yeah, it's both, right? At the beginning, clearly, the censorship was in part to help Chinese companies grow markets, and they didn't want Facebook or the other places to have it. But I think there is still a very heavy censorship concern because they're worried that they won't be able to get Facebook to be as involved in the censorship as Renren and all the others.
Foreign reserves?
I think on that question, it's fundamentally a censorship issue. Yeah. If Facebook offers to work for free in China, they still not allow Facebook to be there. On the monetary issue, I think the real problem is the debt level. Because over the last 10, 15 years, China has built up a lot of leverage in its economy. And a lot of investments have been wasted. Now, it's really the time for reckoning, and they are delaying that process. So what we're seeing, capital flight, everything else is really the symptom of a fundamental rot in the Chinese economy, and the Chinese leadership is going to kick the can down the road for another about 2 years.
One, I think, thing that's important to remember about the Chinese economy that they have had an amazing trajectory without any major cyclical downturns. And the way they've done this is by borrowing from the state-owned banks and investing in stimulus, largely in infrastructure. And now they're into another round of this. So their debt is almost 250% of GDP. That's very high. You can't, their debt isn't like our debt. Everybody loves our debt. But it's not quite so easy to get people to invest in Chinese debt as US T-bills. So this is a problem that is going to, at some point, as Minxin suggests, you'll have to deal with it.
There's a microphone on this side of the room. Yes.
Lee Pardee, Aspen. We read a lot about the governmental campaign against corruption. How extensive has this been, and most of all, how effective?
Minxin, I know you have a whole book coming on this.
Yeah, I have just written a book on corruption, so I had to be the reigning authority on corruption. It's quite effective in treating the symptoms. So if you go to China today, the officials are actually stealing less. It is true. If you want to give somebody a red envelope, say, what do you want to do, put me in jail? They're eating out less, they're getting healthier, as I I've learned. But it's, the campaign is not treating the symptom, the cause. The cause of corruption in China is really government control of wealth. And when you have the state in control of so much wealth, probably 200% of GDP, then the people who are in control of the wealth cannot resist stealing. And if you don't deal with that fundamental aspect of the problem, you are only going to scratch the surface.
And they have low salaries and no
Very
stock
low
options.
salaries, yeah. No stock options. Yeah. And no freedom of the media, which is the best cure for corruption.
Yeah. So who has the next microphone? Yes, Gary.
Hi, I'm Anna Chang. Hi, Orville, and hi, Adam. Great to see you. I want to express the fact that when I speak with CEOs in China, and I go to China and I come across them very frequently, they don't share the sentiment that you elite and experts have, or nor the American journalists, who tend to look at China very negatively. I don't know a single Chinese CEO who shares those concerns. Even on the South China Sea issue, they say, we Chinese are only responding to the pivot that Obama introduced, and we have to build up militarily because US is taking a very aggressive stance. So I'd like to sort of find this disconnect. How do we bridge this gap? As you know, your own Ronnie Chang was here just last month, and C.H. Tung, the Exchequer of Hong Kong, was here giving that specific message on South China Sea. There are 1,000 wells that are drilled in South China Sea. China has not drilled a single well, and that there's so much misunderstanding, and the journalists are misrepresenting the United States.
Who would like to
Can you
engage
talk on
this?
that?
Well, go ahead.
You go ahead.
All right.
So
Well,
Orville
well,
and
first of all, I'd say I'm glad you raised this point because it's very easy to think that the whole of China is just one sort of, explosion waiting to happen. I have a son working in Shanghai, and I have to say, when you go there and when you get down at the level of people in small businesses or even large businesses in the actual workaday life, there's tremendous energy, excitement, and even, I think, optimism. I think you were hearing four people who are really representing and I think are in a position to tell you how Americans and the American government and even American business, which is getting increasingly dispirited about China, are feeling. Now, if you look on the other side, you do find pockets of optimism and more hopefulness, and you do find, I think, a very different perspective. So it's worth noting that.
Yeah. I think the Chinese business community is a diverse group. I don't know the kind of businessmen you meet with. Are they from large state-owned enterprises? Are they from the likes of Baidu or Alibaba, which are really surrogates of the state-owned enterprise because their businesses cannot operate without support from the government? But if they're from smaller private sector businesses, probably they're going to think very differently on these issues. I have to say that the Chinese tend to be very nationalistic. So on South China Sea, there will be more consensus. And I blame that consensus on the absence of a vigorous open discussion. Because in China, the government has fed most people a narrative which has absolutely no basis in reality, in history, or in legality. And if you do not have such a dialogue with them, of course they're going to give you the party line. So that's why I think we should not take CEOs' words as their face value. And it's for Hong Kong tycoons, I actually have very little respect for them.
I mean, I would be more willing to cast some doubt on the U.S. Quite honestly, if we weren't hearing it from the Southeast Asian countries themselves, right? The idea that the U.S. has put the Philippines or Malaysia or Vietnam up to this, I think is insulting to those people and suggests that we have some type of influence and power that we just do not have, right? Those countries are reacting to Chinese behavior that has very little to do with what the U.S. was doing. And China may have legitimate concerns about and complaints about U.S. surveillance over the Hainan Island and other places, right? We don't like it if the Chinese try to surveil Long Island, so I can understand whether there is pushback there. But that is not what you hear in Hanoi or Manila or any other place.
So we have only about 5 minutes here. If there are any more questions, we'll take the questions seriatim, and then we'll answer them as a group. Yes?
Yeah, David Kunyan, can you tie the story of modern China and the pivot that you're describing to the Russian situation? We've heard earlier today about Putin and some of the adventurism that's going on there. I'd love to understand. We've always historically seen, going back to Nixon, the alliance between sort of China and Russia, and exactly what's the update to that sort of.
Great, the Chinese and Russian connection. We'll take that question. Where's the next microphone for another question? Yes.
So my question is about the publishers who were disappeared, and the one who returned to Hong Kong and reported. I'd like to know what's going on with that.
Great. Publishers and booksellers, another question. Yes, over here.
Mike Pillsbury in his book makes the point that the Chinese government systematically misrepresents America's involvement in China going way back to the late 18th and 19th century. And that this misrepresentation is designed to create a sense of great power conflict, where actually the United States played a huge role in founding China's key institutions, in transferring technology, and in making China what it is today. Right, what can we do to reverse this intentional misperception?
100-year marathon book by Michael Pillsbury. One more question, yes. Then yes.
I'd like to know what's the future for Hong Kong, politically and economically, that you see?
Great. So here are 4 questions we have on the table. We have 5 minutes left, so I'll ask you each. So the questions are the China-Russia connection, et cetera, the Hong Kong publishers and news booksellers who were disappeared, the narrative as exemplified in Michael Pillsbury's book, and the Hong Kong situation more generally. Adam, I'll give you first crack on any of those you would like.
I'll take China-Russia. So actually, the Chinese and Russians just signed a whole series of new cooperative agreements. But it is right now a relationship of convenience, right? They both get to poke the United States in the eye over certain kind of global governance issues. But the Chinese do not have any hope that Russia is going to be a long-time power. Right? They see the demographic and economic writing on the wall. And I think they are skeptical of Putin's long-term sustainability. But they have useful cooperation on energy and some other things like that. But we're not going to see long-term cooperation. The Chinese see that their peer power is the United States. They don't see Russia playing the same role.
Minxin.
Hong Kong booksellers. Yeah. This is really an extra data point to show how the old rule books have been thrown out the window, because you just do not go to Hong Kong, grab somebody, and then make that person confess. When you read the details, it's a very disturbing story. And then about Hong Kong, I think Hong Kong is caught in this very negative conversion of trends. That is, the political relationship with Chinese are unraveling, because the new generation of Hong Kong people do not identify themselves with China. And secondarily, Hong Kong's economy is really in a very dire situation because of globalization and because of Hong Kong's own competitiveness is eroding. So the future of Hong Kong is actually pretty pessimistic. Yeah.
So Orville, you can have Russia, Hong Kong, or the narrative that China has about America and being encircled, as Michael Pillsbury argued.
Okay. I mean, the narrative. I mean, I think actually the Chinese narrative is is a historical trap for them, because as long as China views the world as preying upon it and them as a victim, which of course is the whole 20th century communist narrative, how can you be equal if you're a victim? And that's really what China wants more than anything, is equality. So, I mean, my own sense is it would be really a tremendously positive thing to write the next chapter of that narrative, which is the chapter they actually have accomplished, which is success. To get off the victim kick, because it doesn't do anybody good, and it makes everybody in a very oppositional frame of mind. Vis-a-vis Hong Kong, let me just raise the parlous question of Taiwan. Here is a bomb waiting to go off. We have an opposition party elected that's in favor of independence. And China's starting to put huge pressure on Taiwan to, there's a word, expression in Chinese, 表态, which means to make expressions of loyalty to your master. And they haven't done it. And where is that going to go? Boy, if that blows up, we have another treaty obligation there in Taiwan. So there are an awful lot of things out there. It's a minefield. And I think what we need is a little more flexibility. The problem is China has launched this idea of core interest, which means it's ours, there's no discussion. And what's that mean? Diplomats don't have any flexibility. Dangerous.
So on that cautionary point, there are more questions to be answered and more opinions to be heard, but that's all the time we have now. Please join me in thanking this excellent panel.